Nice to see you again, David.
Michael, good to see you, and thank you for coming in again.
Yeah, I appreciate that you have me here again. And please tell me, how did you find out about Billy?
So I had graduated college, and I had come out to Las Vegas for a job interview with a bank. And I met my friend Will out here, and he stayed at a house north of town here. And he and I were co-God believers at the time, and we were both good students, and we both knew the scripture pretty well and had lots of questions, of course, seeing the contradictions, and were in the process of unlearning God belief is probably the best way I can say it. And when we showed up at his house, he had the Contact from the Pleiades photo book on his dining table, and he had put it there purposely, knowing I would immediately pick it up, like, what's this? And so, of course, that's how I learned about it. And I'm reading it and realizing that the pictures are so good, and that the few quotes that were in there made perfect sense to me. And so that was my initial introduction to who Billy Meyer was and the extent of his case. The next thing I got was The Light Years. The book Light Years came out.
By Gary Kinder.
Gary Kinder, which actually that book was published by Lee Elders.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
I didn't. It's in there. I didn't see it until recently, but yeah. So I read that, of course, and then a few years after that, my brother Dan sent me Wendell's book called A Preliminary Investigation Report, which was very well documenting his research into the case, which was fascinating to me. I read it thoroughly and saw how well prepared he was, the labs he used, the methodology, the record keeping, and saw that here's this military guy with good training bringing that expertise to the case, which really made me think all the more how accurate it was. And then in 1991, I was married at the time, and my wife and I were in Carmel, California, and we would go to bookstores. And I saw the first two contact reports from Wendell, the rare ones that are not well translated, but I bought those immediately and read those, of course. And as choppy as it was, I understood a lot of it and helped me even more. And then I had a chance to meet Wendell.
Oh, I see. You said like unlearning God belief. Where does that come from?
So good question. So we were, having been raised a Catholic, and went to Catholic grade school. So I was in Mass 6 days a week for 8 years. So you naturally have God as the center of your consciousness in a way. But I had, quote unquote, become a Christian, if you would, in 1975, and then began to read the scripture thoroughly, which made me ask more questions than it answered. It answered a lot at first, but then you read about Elijah going to heaven in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire and different things. And then just the contradictions that are in all God belief and the hypocrisy of the God believers. Nobody really follows it. Okay? So I was realizing that there was a lot of untruth with it. And then we read about how the Bible was put together. We were told as young people that it's the Word of God. And then when you realize that there are scrolls written by men, ancient scrolls in different languages, scrolls that have holes in them, and they have to vote on parts of the translation. And then I realized, I'm going from either Hebrew or Aramaic, then into Greek, then into Latin, then into English, and realizing how many mistakes there were. I was just beginning to unlearn this whole idea of God belief, and it helped that we moved out here, I took the job, and I moved away from my social circle where we were all God believers. We were Christians. And so I had more of an opportunity to think for myself, think by myself, do my own research. And then, of course, I saw the Meyer material, and that really helped me understand that if there is no God, there is still a law of creation. There are still morals and ethics. There is still evolution and a right way to think and live. And that's how I gravitated so much into learning about Billy's stuff.
Yeah. Have you ever been to Hinterschmidt, really?
I have not, and I never really felt the need. Frankly, to me, his words are true. I see the truth in them. I see that he's an honorable man, and I didn't feel the need to meet him to convince me of that.
Yeah, he told me that the writings and the teachings should have been enough, but they knew that we are so stubborn and brainwashed basically by religion that it needs more, and that's why they decided that he has to take photos and audio recording and the metal samples and so on, and also showed themselves to the witnesses that they were there earlier, and things like that, so that people would become more interested, and also that they need that, they're so stuck, they're so incapable of reasoning on a logical way that the writings wouldn't have been enough. So, and I think that's a good example. You don't need, though you studied the preliminary investigation report by Wendell, but that seemed to be more like just a confirmation, because you already discovered that this makes more sense.
And then meeting Wendell, that's a fun story too. So around 1990 or 91, there was, before the internet, of course, the newspaper here in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, would have a thing about here's what's happening locally. And there was a tiny little ad in there, maybe 2 lines. Not even an ad, just a little report, if you would, advertising the UFO Congress in a Showboat Hotel here in Las Vegas. Well, I was working at the bank at that time, and I had a certain amount of freedom of movement. And so I could go to that. It was a week-long convention, and I found out that Wendell was going to be there. And so I went down to meet Wendell at that. And whatever he bought, whatever he was selling, because he would speak, I would go hear him speak. And then he would be at his table afterwards, and he would be selling the books. Just him. And I would go, of course, after listening to him, I would go to his table and talk to him and buy whatever he was offering at that time and read it, which included the Ask It contacts, more of the contact notes, 3 and 4. And then we just kind of didn't really become friends, but he knew it was true, and I would ask him, and he was totally convinced. He called it hands down the best UFO case he'd ever investigated. I continued to go to those conferences. They ended up moving to Laughlin, and even one of them was up at a town called Mesquite, about 80 miles north of here. And so every time, if he was going to be there, I would go. And I would only go, it would be a week, I would only go the day he was speaking, and that's it, because the rest of them were, frankly, a bunch of kooks.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Travis Walton was at one of them. I didn't bother talking to him at the time. We knew of his story. In fact, his story, I was living in Missouri, and it made our newspaper. I remember reading it like, what? This is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is fascinating. But anyway, so that's how I ended up meeting Wendell, and because and this went on for many years, these meetings, and then that's how we ultimately ended up arranging to interview him for hours on camera, which you now have a good copy of.
Yeah, I saw this interview that Michael Horn put out where Wendell Stevens is interviewed, and you organized it, or what was the situation?
That's a good question. The reality is that it was my brother Dan, who's a year and a half older than me, and he's familiar with the case, very much so too, and he's rather fascinated by it. Well, he wanted to put a birthday present together for me. He was the one that arranged the get-together with Wendell and George Knapp and Michael. He was a member of a local club, if you would, and so we arranged to meet there and have food there. And when I realized how rare this was going to be, I had a friend at the time. He was a television producer, and he had all of the equipment, the cameras and the lighting and the mics and what have you. And so I hired him to video our gathering. And so it turned out to where it was mostly George Knapp and I that were interviewing Wendell and Michael at times. And then, Michael spoke quite a bit at that point too, but we were mostly interested in Wendell. And so we ended up having a very professional documentary quality footage, which you've seen only one camera on Michael's site. Mm-hmm. It's a 2-camera shoot. And so on most of the cameras, then you have, Dan and I are in one camera and the 3 of them are in another. Of course, we moved around some too. And the food in there is really something too, when you see it. But it was 2008. I can't remember how old Wendell was, but I realized he's not going to be around that much longer. So I ended up contacting him privately. I developed more of a relationship with him, of course, after that. And I said, hey, I want to interview you again. And so we then drove to him in Tucson and rented an Embassy Suites. And he came to the Embassy Suites Hotel the next morning. Of course, we had to spend the night. And this time I borrowed my friend's cameras. I asked my nephew, who's a camera guy, to fly out from Missouri and go with us so that he would be the cameraman. And so he did. And so we have another, and this was probably 6 hours. The first one was 5. May even be longer than that. But we interviewed Wendell again down in Tucson. And this time it was just my brother Dan and I. Michael and George Knapp were not there. And so it's really just the 3 of us on that camera. Mm-hmm. And I haven't yet seen that one. And it's been 2008 as well, maybe 2009.
Yeah, we'll check that out.
We'll hopefully see that soon.
Yeah, we will.
Let's talk about the Talmud.
Yeah.
Okay.
You acknowledged in the Talmud Jmmanuel.
It's the first translation of the 5th edition.
Of the 5th edition.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the correct German edition, you could say.
Yes.
How came that about?
So I had purchased those conferences that I mentioned to you, the Talmud Jmmanuel, one of the earlier versions. It was fascinating to me. And so I kept buying the newer versions. And then I went to a meeting in Prescott, Arizona. And I met a group that called themselves at the time Toward the Truth. And it was all around the Meyer stuff. Michael was not there. So they had meetings, and I found out from them that the 5th version was out, but there wasn't yet an English translation. There was a guy there that was doing some English translation. He didn't release any of it to us. And I had a burning desire to know. I wanted to know. So I knew at that time that Wendell Stevens was doing translations of other things for Billy, and that he had a contract. I ended up buying the book from Figu, the German. First I tracked Benjamin down. I emailed him and asked him if he would translate the new TJ5 if I would send it to him, and he said yes, he would. So I ended up buying the book from Figu and having them send the book to Benjamin. But before then, Christian emailed me and said, we haven't contracted with him to do that. Why are you doing this? And I said, I want to know. I'm doing it for me. He's translating it for me privately, which was totally true. And so Christian said, okay. So he sent Benjamin the book. And then Benjamin then began to do translations for me, free, and just send them to me, email, which I was amazed at. And the difference between the other TJs and this one, A very specific one that to me made a whole lot more sense was where in the earlier ones where Isa Rashid had translated certain words into Israelites. In this version, it was God believers, which made more sense to me that Emmanuel would speak to the whole world of God believers and not just to this group, which I'm sure he did too. So anyway, Benjamin was translating that just for me, and then he had marital issues and financial issues. And so he put it aside for a while. And after a few months, I asked him how much he would charge me to continue to do the translations. And he gave me such a low amount. He says $11 an hour. This, what is it, I can't remember how many years ago it was. I wrote him back. I said, your fee is too low. I said, I'll get back to you in a little while. So a couple months later, I basically made an arrangement. I said, I'll pay you $15 an hour. And so he then began to do more translations again, just for me. I would get them by email. And every time he would tell me how many hours he worked on that particular chapter, and I would send him the money. Eventually, I ran into some financial challenges kind of near the end of that. I had been to a meeting at Michael Horn's house in Munns Park, and I met Blake Parnell. And I had asked everybody at the meeting, I told them what I was doing with the Talmud and asked them if anybody would help me out. And Blake was the only one that said, I'll do that. Then it became Blake and I that were paying Benjamin. And so we would both get emails of the translations. Then I sent Jim one of the chapters and told him what I was doing. And he says, I'll help. And so Jim ended up sending some money to Benjamin as well. And at the very end, Jim soured on it because Jim had written a book, published it really exciting, and it was very well put together. And his assertion was that the Talmud was the source document for the book of Matthew. And Billy ends up saying that isn't the case. And when Jim saw that, he soured on the project and he was no longer interested in it. And he was helping out quite a bit. And at the end, I was having some financial challenges, and that's when Blake contacted Nate, and Nate ended up paying a little bit of money too. Finally, the book got finished. I had all the chapters. I put them together in a booklet, if you would, and sent copies to Nate and Blake and Larry Driscoll, my friend Larry Driscoll in Arizona. Then, of course, the book got published by Figu. The Christian had offered me to publish the book. They were honorable. I hadn't expected to make any money on my effort. It cost us $16,000 to translate it. Yeah. And according to PayPal, I paid $8,500 towards that.
And it was all by email.
All of it was by email.
Did you ever meet him or?
Never met him, and I've only spoke once to him. But throughout the whole thing, we never spoke. Oh. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, we would now and then make comments, like when it's against creation for men to give birth or something like that. Benjamin and I, both of us thought, why is he even telling them that? I mean, there were a few comments we would make like that, but mostly it was fascinating. Benjamin, thank you. Here's the money.
Yeah.
We really didn't even have a lot of conversation in email.
Yeah.
It was a project that we were both determined to get done.
Yeah. You're really interested in that book because you were raised very religiously.
Yes.
And you still kind of keep an interest in
Oh, yeah.
It seems like you're still kind of interested, even though kind of you read it now, you know what's in it. But still, it seems to inspire you, or I don't know what
it does.
Is it? Yeah.
It inspires me because of that it's so succinct in its language. And Billy has a way sometimes of being verbose, lots of words. Emmanuel didn't seem to speak like that. Emmanuel was much more compact with his words and said very truthful, accurate things with good insight. Plus the story, right, that's in there, that's not in the New Testament. For instance, him meeting Paul, or Saul, I should say. Mm-hmm. And then the event with Saul and the fireworks, as I called it, right? He used fireworks to blind Saul on the way to Damascus. Or the story of the Emmanuel and his family, when they were young, were beamed out into, and they went to Egypt by ship, is how I understand it. And I'm convinced that the 4 businessmen, Billy calls them businessmen, but they really were traders, would probably be a better translation. Instead of the 3 kings from the east, the 4 traders that brought wealth to the family, knowing who Emmanuel was. I'm persuaded that's how they survived in Egypt. They used that wealth to survive for however long they were in Egypt. Joseph wasn't able to work down there, highly unlikely.
Yeah.
Probably didn't speak the language. And so, I mean, stories like that are in there that just make so much more sense to me, and they're logical. The relationship of of Emmanuel and Mary Magdalene. That effectively they were raised together.
Yeah.
Okay? They weren't lovers.
Yeah.
They weren't technically related. The prophecies are more accurate. The fact that there were women that followed him too, and frankly, one of the more powerful things in there is what Emmanuel says about women in, I think it may be chapter 30, but it's while he was arrested. And it's very enlightening and very powerful. So the book really still speaks to me.
You remember what he said? What was it?
He said the woman is the light of the world. Okay? Unlike, in the Beatitudes or much earlier in Matthew, he kind of indicates that the believers are the light of the world. Not here. The women are the light of the world, and they're the ones that make life soft for us. And he was speaking to those men, and he criticized them for how they treated their women.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that they subjugate them, and they're mean to them, and that they don't deserve it. Anyway, there's some very positive things in there. And then it's hard to read because, as you know, they beat the crap out of them. And that part of it is more, there's some detail in there that you can see how hard it was for Emmanuel.
Yeah.
He didn't want to do it.
Yeah, and you can see the church hasn't learned anything, has it?
No.
I mean, no priestesses in the Catholic Church, So, no equality and so on.
No.
So, that's a whole different point of view, of course. And that makes it probably not so popular in certain circles, I guess.
It's not. You have to be very careful.
Yeah.
It's just like everybody. You talk about this stuff, you just have to be careful.
Yeah.
Even though it's not politics, they don't want to talk about it. But I use the word God believers out there and God belief.
Yeah,
and it's fascinating to me, I'll tell you this, that when I do that and I have a conversation with some very intelligent people, they respond with the word religion. It's different. I'm thinking God belief. They're thinking religion. They're different. Religion is an organized system of, really, Billy even mentioned it, that the true religion it's really just an organized set of morals and ethics and a way to live. You extract God belief from it, and then you have proper religion or proper code of ethics. But when I use the word God belief, people don't get it. They come back and say, they use the word religion in the discussion. And I point out to them, that's not what I'm referring to.
Can you explain that in more detail? Well, what's the difference for you? How do you see the difference in God belief and religion? Religion, a kind of institution?
Yeah. Religion is the institution that's built around God belief today. Okay?
Yeah.
God belief is the inspiring idea that perhaps not Buddhism, but almost every other religion has some, anthropomorphic God at the beginning of it. And that's a false God belief, right? There, as we know, that's an illusion, it's an invention. And so God belief, to me, is a much more accurate description of the problem, the false ideas surrounding earth humanity. Because let's face it, there's a lot of, let's say, the commandments in religion. Don't kill, don't steal. Those are good ideas. They don't have anything really to do with God belief,
Yeah.
okay? But they make it about God belief. Religions do. And so to me, if you can just recognize that God is an invention and God belief is something you don't want to have, then now you can really form a proper code of ethics around the idea that there is a law of creation, cause and effect, logic. All of these things are universal principles that people make a religion out of it because they put God attached to it. And they think that God is the one that imposes those rules. But it's not. Those rules are part of human evolution that would be common everywhere.
The God belief precedes the religion.
Yes.
Without it, you wouldn't have the religion. So the cause, or the main problem is the God belief, not the religion.
That's
basically.
correct. That's right.
And what they make out of it.
Frankly, if you could take God belief out of a lot of religions, you could still have a cohesive group of people building their lives around common beneficial ideas. And they might even still call it religion, but it's a godless religion.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so I don't have a problem with, to me, when I think of the word religion, I don't really think of the religious institutions. I think of religion as just a code. But God belief is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the belief in the deity or whatever is worshipped.
Yes.
And
Whether, well, like in the days before even the invaders, from space made themselves out to be deities to early humanity. Before that, there was still gods. Cultures still had gods, whether they saw them from a comet or they invented them or from the sun. They still had gods versus God. Mm-hmm. And so they built their religions around gods. And so I could say God, God's belief, but it makes more sense to me, God belief.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
David.
And thank you.
Yeah, and hope to see you again. And,
me too. And maybe in Switzerland one of these
maybe
days.
in Switzerland. Yeah, it's a beautiful country. Okay, thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.